The DeFi landscape is definitely growing on the Cardano ecosystem, and in this interview I have Brandon joining me from Yamfore. Pretty interesting protocol, a different one in that you can borrow crypto assets from their platform and there are no margin calls. There is indefinite timelines in terms of how long you can do these loans for as well. So it's completely different to how a lot of these peer-to-peer lending protocols work on other ecosystems where there is that time limit and there are margin calls when the price of your assets drop and it's below that amount that the loan is collateralized for. So this is a very interesting take on all that, and the team from Yamfore are doing some really cool things. Now let me just pull this up for you. Now the team have put together a funding mechanism for themselves, and this is the bonds that they're selling as unique NFTs. Let me just go through a couple of details here. So it talks a little bit about the actual protocol itself, and you can read up a little bit more about it. All the links down below for you. But so let me just go down a little bit further here. So the NFBO, the Non-Fungible Bond Offering, is essentially 5% of the total circulating supply of the YAM tokens there. So it's worth 50 million YAMs. It's a representation of that. So if we go down a little bit further down here, they've got the minting for this for 31 days only. It's locked in after that policy ID is locked for this particular thing. Now they'll be selling this for $50 US each and at a total of 5,000 NFBOs being sold. You can get to the details on their website. Minting ends on the 14th of September. So recording this, it is the 21st of August at the moment. So there is still time if you're interested in this project, but please watch this entire interview so you have a really good understanding of what the protocol is trying to do, what the team and Brandon are building for the Cardano ecosystem, and of course go through their white paper and everything else around it. It's a bit of a different concept, so you may need to just get your head around the idea and concept before diving into this one. But let's get into this interview. I have Brandon joining me on this episode to talk about Yamfore. Interesting name here, but a really cool product. Absolutely love this one. Very different to what you may be used to out there in the DeFi space. Brandon, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, hello. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right. So let's find out a little bit about your background first and what on earth you're building. Can you give us a little idea and overview of how you got into the crypto space and what you're trying to build out for the Cardano ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Brandon. I'm the founder of Yamfore. So Yamfore is a decentralized lending protocol building on Cardano. Yamfore is what we're coining a CBLP, so community-backed lending protocol. And the really cool thing about Yamfore is Yamfore aims to give borrowers basically a very passive sort of like crypto-backed loan with no interest repayments, no liquidation risk, no margin calls, and indefinite loan terms. Now that's quite a lot I've sort of gone through, but the really cool thing about the protocol is the liquidity is actually owned by the protocol itself. So when loans are initiated through Yamfore, you can only borrow, you can't sort of provide liquidity. When loans are initiated through Yamfore, the protocol itself is actually taking a risk as well as the user, and actually sort of like having that sort of like burden. So the user can basically have this sort of passive position in ADA, really crypto-backed loan position, without having to worry about liquidation risk / margin calls. So that's the kind of crux of Yamfore. My background, I used to actually, funny enough, I used to work in a completely different field. So I used to do mental health nursing. And I got into the crypto space roughly around last year. About the beginning of it is when I sort of found out about Bitcoin. And I think like many others, I sort of went through just like the Bitcoin. Then I sort of, I looked at sort of this notion of this decentralized money, right? That was like non-censorable. You could really transfer value to another person, from one participant to another one, with no intermediary parties. And that was super, super interesting to me. Then you kind of move on quickly to Ethereum, because there's always kind of a need of like, okay, what's the next sort of step? Like, can we sort of like do other things on here?
Yeah.
Right? So smart contracts, that's kind of just like, it's amazing, right? Because all of a sudden you kind of like, you've onboarded just a sense of intellect, right? Because Bitcoin in a lot of ways, it's you know, it's definitely it's a store of value, and it does quite a tremendous job at that. But Ethereum's kind of the next step in the sense of like, you can have DeFi, you can have DAOs, you can have NFTs, you can have all these sort of things. You can have these contractual agreements that with having this sort of notion of code is law, right? So you can do some interesting things like lending, borrowing, like just to mention, yeah, DAOs, NFTs. And I think when you look at, and then how I ended up in Cardano, if you look at Ethereum and you kind of look at it from a very sort of like macro standpoint, and you kind of see the issues there when it comes to scalability, the lack of governance. There was the infamous DAO hack in 2016, right? So that was kind of like a lack of governance there in that sort of aspect. Like, how does a protocol sort of weave its way through evolution and to sort of decide what sort of upgrades are going to be just agreed upon and sort of like implemented without having to have this constant sort of fear of like a hard fork, right? Like, who's going to be on this chain, who's going to be on that sort of chain. So all those things and a couple more as well. Overall, Ethereum seemed like a very sort of like a step in the right direction, but definitely needed a lot of refinement sort of to sort of get where it's what it needs to go eventually. And that's where I sort of come over to Cardano. So Cardano, I think after the whiteboard video by Charles, that was really my first introduction to it. And that was a person really addressing all the concerns I had when it comes to governance, right? When it comes to scalability, how are we actually going to sort of get going through this how are we actually going to onboard people, because at the moment you can't quite point to any blockchain that can sort of onboard like 1 billion people or like or even multiple millions, right? So we're still not quite there yet. But then just sort of going through that video, sort of going through the plans and sort of just this forethought and this very sort of academic rigor and sort of just like research-driven approach, that was very, very just very compelling. So that's kind of how I landed up here. And you learn certain things like, I could definitely go on, right? The accounting model, the extended UTXO versus the accounts model of Ethereum, right? Why just having the local states and the parallelization of that is just a lot more superior for actually having this sort of scalable sort of network and just a whole facet of things. But safe to say Cardano, Ergo, and I don't know if it's blasphemous to talk about some other blockchains, but they're definitely
totally fine.
Yeah, they're definitely the handful of ones that I think people, if you're really sort of like in the space and you really sort of if you had to point to a couple that actually had a proper chance of just being here, lasting the test of time and actually possibly achieving what they're setting out to do, that would be it. It'd be Cardano, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and and Ergo, and a couple. But that's a bit of my background. Yamfore just quickly. That came as a result of frustration, so a product of frustration. Because in other words, I really want to take a crypto-backed loan out where I just didn't have to worry about just getting liquidated. Because if you're in the crypto space, we're in the space where there's like 50% drawdowns can happen within just a couple of hours, or like within an hour or so. So it's kind of a very it's very much you need a lot of risk management skills, and just you need to be very aware if you're taking these sort of traditional crypto-backed loans, whether through like, let's say, Aave or Compound on Ethereum. And it's kind of just, I look for solutions in the sense of, okay, I don't mind paying like a higher interest rate, or maybe I have to have a lower loan to value ratio, like some other sort of like something to avoid basically getting liquidated, because that was the biggest sort of like issue I found. But long story short, I couldn't find anything of that sort of nature. So I thought to myself, and it didn't even start off as me sort of going, oh, I'll build a protocol, because that's a bit of a crazy thought.
It's about, you go from, I can't find a product that really fits my needs, I'll just go build it.
It
does that.
It was more of just like a mental, like a thought exercise, right? And I actually had given up on the idea several times, like just a couple of months of like, okay, if I was to do it, how would I sort of do this? Okay, first I'd have to have liquidity actually owned by the protocol itself, because the Venn diagram of people willing to like take out, these crypto-backed loans versus the people that just want a stable return on the stable coins, they don't really mix, so to speak. And just going through the motions, it has to be on Cardano because we can use staking as this sort of like brilliant mechanism where the asset itself. And then if you're also, if you're building on Cardano, I feel like in a lot of ways, you are sort of taking this indirect sort of bet, really essentially on the longevity and prosperity of the blockchain you're building on, right? So let's just make that even more direct by just having this sort of like faith, all-encompassing faith in the ADA, basically the success of ADA itself, because that's tied to the success of Cardano. So in a lot of ways, it's like a house loan, because if because the notion sounds crazy to people generally, but if you take a house loan out and those loans aren't marked to market, so if the market drops down 30, 50%, etc., if you can keep up with your mortgage payments, the bank doesn't mind, because in the bank's mind, it's eventually going to rebound, more likely than not. I should say, and or if the person just keeps up with the payments and eventually sort of goes through. But that's kind of the mindset of Yamfore. I realize that's quite a lot to go through. So if
so let's first talk about how these crypto loans work at the moment. And you said like a downfall in the market, margin calls. So what is that mechanism that people need to be aware of? So if I go to Aave, for example, and I put in 100 ETH on there, to take, I wish I had 100 ETH, but if I put 100 ETH in there and the price of ETH drops down past 50%, what happens? What would I see when I actually put in the loan, and what happens if the price drops that much?
Yeah. So in the crypto space, generally speaking, people, any sort of loan that you take, right, without this notion of identity or sort of like registration, without having some sort of like, I suppose like an NFT identity, right, it has to be an over collateralized loan, and that's just because incentives are there, so the person that's borrowing has to sort of repay back because it's in the best financial interest, right? So over collateralization basically just means that you as a borrower seeking a crypto-backed loan, you give out your assets that are worth more than the stablecoin payment, than the loan that you're receiving, loan payment. So typically speaking, with like, let's say an Aave or a Compound, in that example with the 100 ETH, right, or whatever really amount, you put it in there and you get a certain like loan to value ratio. So loan to value ratio is basically just what is the value that you're getting back in regards to your assets that you're sort of using as security, right? So like if you have 100K and you sort of 100K worth of Ethereum or some crypto asset, you put it in there and it's an 80% loan to value ratio. That just means that you're getting 80% back of your collateral that you're depositing. So in that case, 80K. So with the Aave or Compound, when you've deposited your collateral in and you get your payment through, you have to maintain, and it will vary at times, right? It varies for certain protocols. You have to maintain a certain a certain collateral value, right? And there's generally sort of and you sort of maintain that value, because in the event that you can't sort of keep up with your interest repayments, right? There's always a and just in the event of like a heavy market downturn, there's enough of a buffer there, so the protocol can be assured that it can sell your assets off in a quick enough rate to make sure that the lender, that's actually the person that's giving you the stablecoin payment on the other side, is always made whole. So you've got those two sort of parties there, and in a lot of ways this works really fantastically well. But if you look at just the way that because you're dealing with these sort of like money markets, right, where like supply and demand is sort of like, it's determined by just how many borrowers do you have versus how many lenders you have. You can find interest rates can quickly move out of your favor, right? There's no such thing as like locking your interest rates in. So you can have these sort of like cases where, like, I believe in MakerDAO at one point, they had interest rates above like, was it like 18%? So like very high double digit sort of like interest rates. It was for a very short period of time, but that's really not quite sustainable if you're, that shouldn't, that's not really long-term. That's not really a long-term sustainable sort of metric, right? Because if you wanted to take out a loan for like 10 years, like, never mind the fact of like, you getting liquidated, just the interest rates, because at some points it's going to be very high, and you just can't afford that, like, that sort of payment. So it's almost a bit not accurate / disingenuous to me when I sort of hear that, like, oh, you can take out, for however long, but because there's really a practicality time limit truly to those, which again is fine. This is DeFi. We're trying out different things, and like, this is sort of like we haven't sort of gotten to where we are yet, but I think that there are better models on the horizon, and at least certainly for what Yamfore is sort of like offering, it's just a different sort of approach, right? And it, just to put it out there as well, it's and people should be encouraged to sort of like look at what fits best for them as well, because I'll explain in a second, but Yamfore does have risks when it comes to just the token itself, right? Because we have this almost like quasi and permanent loss sort of factor when you sort of like look at the sort of like how Yamfore sort of like works. So a loan on Yamfore, even though it's got no interest repayments, no liquidation risk, no margin calls, indefinite loan terms, like truly indefinite, it might not be the best fit for everyone. So you sort of have to just, especially if like the loan to value ratio of Yamfore is something like 50-50, like, so 50% Yam, 50% ADA, which I should probably get into.
How does Yamfore then differ to Aave and Compound in the mechanics of how it works? Do we still over collateralize our loans with ADA? You also mentioned that it has its own token as well. How does that and all of that come into play with it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So basically how Yamfore works is when you it's still over collateralized loans, right? But essentially the deficit that generally would be made up with the same collateral value. So in the case of, like, let's say you had 100K worth of like ADA assets, right? And you want to take a loan, out for a crypto through Yamfore, a crypto-backed loan. You basically deposit the 100K worth of assets into Yamfore, and based on what the stablecoin treasury amount is, because the protocol itself has like an internal stablecoin treasury amount, and this stablecoin treasury will be made up. It will be made up of native assets to Cardano, right? So we're talking like the JED. Like when Liquid's stablecoin comes out, when Ardana's comes out as well. So just stablecoins that are native to the ecosystem, they aren't bridged from a different sort of different blockchain, and also there's verifiable on-chain assets as well, which is really important because you don't want that trust factor when it comes to like, okay, what happens if there's a bank run, right? And obviously these will be you can add and / remove these via governance, on-chain governance, right? When you enter a loan position through Yamfore, you basically just have to sort of like, based on the stablecoin treasury amount, you have to split your ADA into a ADA to Yam ratio, right? So in the case of, let's say the stablecoin treasury is at like 62%, right? That would be an ADA to Yam ratio off the top of my head of like 80-20, right? So it basically means for your 100K, you keep 80K in ADA, 20K is in Yam. Now, when you deposit that sort of your collateral in that sort of configuration, 80K in ADA, 20K in Yam, you always get a 1-to-1 ratio of your ADA collateral back, right? So your ADA collateral, that portion with the 80-20, basically that's the loan to value ratio as well. So right there, so when you deposit that in, all the protocol cares about essentially is if your ADA collateral is at or above 105% of the principal value borrowed. So in the case of 80K, it's just asking is your ADA collateral at 84K or above. So when it's at that level, you get to close your loan position and you get to have your Yam tokens back. So your Yam tokens are never touched by the protocol. They act as a security deposit for actually securing a loan position through Yamfore, right? So that's never sort of liquidated. Doesn't really matter what happens. So ADA could, like, if you entered a loan position through Yamfore and ADA dropped 99%. It wouldn't matter at all. Like, as long as ADA eventually gets to the 105% of the principal amount that you borrowed, that's when you can exit your loan position. And of course, you can also choose to pay the difference, pay the deficit, right? So this could be in a case of, like, let's say ADA, your Yam to ADA ratio is like 50-50 or something, and you really want to get your Yam tokens back, right? And you think Yam's going to drop a lot more than ADA, so it would make sense for you to pay that deficit, especially if it's like, So that's the kind of like crux with that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting mechanism. So like the market could fluctuate so much for the Yam token. The Yam token might skyrocket and triple in value, for example, which means that that whole loan value that's locked in, I can't remember what you called it, would increase in general, right? So ADA might go up, Yam might go up, and then you can exit position early, get all those tokens back.
Exactly. It would only be on your ADA collateral. The protocol doesn't care about the Yam price at all. So it only cares about the ADA collateral price. So it's a really interesting way, because you basically just like bootstrap an asset. Because if you do the math, if you had, like, let's say $1 million worth of money in the stablecoin treasury, and the value of Yam should only really be in just like in proportion to the value of the stablecoin treasury, because you only need a bit of Yam essentially to get a loan position. And obviously with the example, like, we have a sliding scale, right? But let's just assume it's like a basic 80-20, right? Like 80, so it's like 80-20 loan to value ratio, like ADA to Yam ratio for like $1 million treasury. So in that case, you basically have to, that's basically 20 divided by 80, which is like 0.25. So in other words, it's like, for every $100 that gets borrowed from the stablecoin treasury, $25 of Yam had to be bought. In other words, to actually to facilitate that. entry. So that means the market cap of YAM is going to be, at least for that sort of scenario where it's like a fixed 80-20 and also like $1 million treasury amount, that means the market cap of YAM is 250K. So that's 250. So that's 250K. If that's just strictly protocol driven demand, if that gets to like, let's say 3x at 750K, then it's kind of for the people like locked in, for the multiple people sort of like locked in, that's obviously that the price of YAM has gotten up, of course, but just as an example of just like how quickly that sort of that could sort of rise. So it's just the value of, I guess sort of just saying the value of YAM should only be in proportion, at least if you're looking at like protocol driven demand, because people can always like add like the market can always add like a level of like confidence to the like the price of YAM or something. Like the market really decides, like truly, right? But if you're looking at just protocol driven demand, like what is the value in quotation marks of like this protocol really bringing towards the YAM token? It's a really nice objective way of looking at it, because you can just kind of because you know that as soon as someone exits the loan position at 80-20, for example, most likely there's going to be someone in a very long line that's interested in actually like picking that up. So you always have that sort of base demand essentially, and as profits are brought in, that amount only really increases, right? And that's a really, really cool thing as well, because whenever the protocol, so when the protocol closes a loan position, right, and it gets, I didn't even mention this, of course, when you deposit your collateral in Yamfore, the sole payment mechanism for the protocol is just the staking rewards, just the ADA staking rewards, and that's it. So all the staking rewards are earned by the borrower's deposited ADA collateral in the protocol, just goes to the protocol. And that's all the payments. That's everything. So your assets are really doing the work for you. But so that's another thing. So when the protocol actually sort of gets those staking rewards / gets the principal back, obviously every single dollar added to the protocol is bringing in 25 cents worth of demand for the YAM token, because that's the YAM token is kind of this pool of like it's a fixed token amount, right? So it's not inflationary, it's deflationary. And obviously, for someone to actually borrow that dollar to actually utilize that, they have to pay 25 cents. So that's kind of like you get the exact same proportional value growth. So if the stablecoin treasury amount goes up by 5%, you get the exact same 5% sort of figure for the YAM tokens as well. So you kind of really sort of like conjoin these sort of like two assets at the hip right there. So that's a really sort of cool thing, because I mean, with that $1 million treasury amount, that example, if it was 2 million, that's another 250K, which is double. Which is double the YAM market. So that's kind of like the sort of like the flat line. And it's simpler than Aave and Compound, but it does things in a different way that most people kind of get caught off guard, and it takes a bit. But that's the general crux of Yamfore, I would say.
Yeah, I think I need to sit down and do a video outline of this in a PowerPoint presentation to really like visualize all the different scenarios at the different ratios that could be, and how much collateral you need exactly to make it all work. But it sounds absolutely brilliant. Who do you have on your team to build this? Are you writing the code for this? Who else is working on it with you?
Yeah, so we're a fairly small team, so just 3 of us, including myself. So I just sort of play this sort of managerial / I guess community sort of like role. So I'm kind of like, I'm in the Discords, I'm in this sort of like Twitter. I'm sort of like, I'm always there available for people to ask me questions, and just more than happy to answer. We've got a front end and back end developer. So we've got Sean. He's our back end developer. He actually finished off the, I believe, Plutus Pioneer course. I'm not sure if it's I think it's a second cohort. And he's got a heavy math background as well. Then we have Anthony. Anthony's our front end dev. So he's also along for the ride. I sort of help out as well here I can, but my skills in that department are quite lacking. So I'm just sort of like, but it's just 3 of us. And the really cool thing with Yamfore, I think, and the reason we're able to do this being such a small team, right, is just Yamfore is not very complicated. It's just it's really just a swap contract with just like modifications, really. Like, so that's the kind of like, so we haven't really aimed for the stars, so to speak. Like what we're doing is interesting, don't get me wrong, but it's in a sort of like a achievable scale. Like we are building this sort of like massive ecosystem with these sort of like all the other sort of like really wonderful teams are doing. Like Liquid Labs, Liquid Finance is doing some really amazing things, right? Ardano's doing some really amazing things. And Like we're sort of just like this very small sort of like almost like boutique lending protocol that we're sort of like building. But with that sort of comes its advantages, right? Because we can sort of remain just very focused and sort of very focused and very sort of like again just sort of straightforward. It's more straightforward, I should say. But that's kind of like that's the team at the moment. We might expand as sort of production sort of goes, but at the moment we're in a comfortable sort of place, and we're getting there progress wise. We're doing not too bad.
Fantastic. So what does the roadmap look like then? You've sounds like you guys have like, working closely together. You're building some things. What have you got at the moment? When do you think you'll have a release for the product?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we have there's mostly two massive stumbling blocks, right? So we're still on schedule to like release in Q1 or Q2 of next year. So that's kind of like that's the goal. But at the moment, like I think like most teams, really, we are kind of like waiting on the Vassal hard fork, really. And the Vassal hard fork just comes with so many improvements, like this, the various SIPs, right, and just the increase in throughput. That's all beneficial. But it's mostly just I think oracles. That's a biggie, because at the moment Cardano doesn't quite there are oracles building, like Charlie 3, and we are looking at them. They're very interesting. And so it's just sort of about getting sort of like that integrated. And the issue with that is like when the oracle integration sort of comes around, depending on how sort of like depending on how extensive it is, we might have to rewrite a bunch of code really sort of fit with the standards of that, right? So it's kind of like one of those sort of things, right, where we sort of have to like, but eventually we'll sort of get through there. So oracles is a big thing. That's a massive roadblock. I think the next thing is also the staking mechanism, which is integral, right? That's integral to Yamfore. So that's going to be a little bit tricky, and it's just those two aspects. Everything else is actually fairly straightforward, because Yamfore is almost like it's almost just that modified sort of like swap contract, but just those two massive things, just the Oracle solutions that there's currently not really quite any at the moment, and we don't really want to build an Oracle solution. We'd rather just trust in people that really sort of have that sort of expertise and sort of like build with them, sort of, or utilize what they're sort of providing. And also the staking mechanism as well, which it seems more just tricky, but I think we'll probably eventually get over that. And the really cool thing as well is like so staking credentials are different from just the individual UTXOs of the loan as well. So what that means basically is just like people can have when they open up a loan position on Yamfore and they initially sort of like, sign that transaction, and everything's like honky-dory. I can't believe I used that word, honky-dory. Everything's fine. The protocol has complete control of the staking credentials, right? So it can just move that delegation around like easily. And of course that's via governance as well. So the really cool thing with Yamfore, that's another thing I haven't mentioned. There's quite a lot of it's not that Yamfore is overly complicated, but there's quite a lot of moving elements occasionally you sort of have to sort of go through. So for anyone really super interested, please read the light paper. It has everything sort of like documented through. But the staking pools is the staking pools that the protocol delegates to are decided via user input. So it's just via on-chain governance, right? It's just this sort of like list of like acceptable staking pools. That's fine for it's fine for the protocol to sort of like stake to, and these are just like trusted staking pools that are like performing well, and they can be voted in or out just depending on sort of like the Yam token holders desires. But yeah,
that's brilliant. It's always good to know that the ADA that's moving out and being locked in smart contracts is also being staked back to those community pools, so it doesn't all disappear from the ecosystem. Now, because you're a small team, it doesn't sound like you need huge amounts of funds to fund and build out the product. But how are you guys funding yourselves at the moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's been bootstrapped for now, but very soon we're having a what's called a non-fungible bond offering. So we're having our NFBO offering, NFBO event. So it's kind of cool. It's actually I probably can't say I can't say the exact time it's coming out, right? It's in Q3, so it's within now to the next, I think, 2 or so months. But it's kind of it's very kind of like similar to almost like a mix between like what a bond is, like a traditional bond offering, and almost like a combination of like an LBE as well. So it's kind of like Yeah, so it's like it's like, let's say X amount of like NFT, X amount of NFTs are available to be minted, right? And each NFT represents like a certain share of like this, let's say a percentage of the treasury, which is like 5% in our case, right?
Yeah.
And depending on how many people mint, let's say it's like out of 5,000, right? And depending on how many people mint it, right? Each, if it sells out within, let's say 2 weeks or so, whatever sort of time frame, it's basically liquid in the sense of like, if only 1,000 people mint it versus the 5,000, then the 5% share sort of evenly gets divided across the 1,000. If like the 5,000, if 5,000 people sort of mint it, it's obviously divided between that. So it's kind of like, it gives it's almost like that price discovery slash kind of like supply and demand sort of metric. So yeah, that's sort of our gist. We'll have more details as we get closer, but yeah.
Really interesting approach there with that one. I kind of like it. I like this new stuff that, people coming up with, the mixed bond, non-fungible bonds, kind of like a liquidity bootstrapping event mixed with NFT sale. Really cool, innovative stuff. Like really, really good idea. Okay, cool. So that's how you're going to fund yourselves. That's absolutely awesome. Okay, so if people want to find out more, you said join the Discord and read the white paper. How do we get the links to that? Where do we go?
Yeah, of course. So you can search up, you can just Google Yamfore, and we should hopefully be the top.
It's a pretty unique name.
Yeah. I have been always checking just because I'm paranoid. I'm like, okay, are we still the top? Okay, we're still the top. You'll find the website there, and you'll find some other links as well, like our Twitter, our GitHub, and a couple of other things as well. If you can find us across all social media platforms, with just, or most of them, I should say, we've pretty much got all of them down pat, really, apart from Telegram, which I believe we've reserved the name for that one. But just Yamfore, just searching up YAMFORE, and you should hopefully easily find us. And yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. Okay, Brandon, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. This is a really interesting and niche project, really cool leading program that you guys are putting together. So I'm looking forward to playing around with this one when it comes out, and getting my hands dirty and trying out the platform itself.
Now, I haven't had a chance to do that whole slideshow breakdown, but hopefully I can, and I'll put it onto our show notes for this episode. You can check that out at learncardano.io/EP057. There you'll be able to find all the show notes for this, the breakdown, the links to everything here, everything around the NFBO, Non-Fungible Bond Offering as well. Everything there on the website. Thank you again, Brandon, for joining me on the episode. And thank you guys for watching this video all the way to the end too. Now, if you really enjoyed it, thumbs up, click subscribe, click the notification bell, and you'll see me in the next video.
Yeah, gotta do it like that. You've been listening to the Learn Cardano podcast. Gotta get it hype. Crypto is what we like, but this is not investment or financial advice. Gotta do your research, cause it's risky. We know it is. This show is educational and it's informative. Crypto's the future, really, it ain't no debate.